Okay, I want to talk about a late modernist painter today. I think he's a fun topic. He's a Catalan man from that region of Spain. He's present throughout the luscious, richest period of modernist painting through the early part of the 20th century, in particular the 1920s, amazing 1920s. He's there on the scene in Paris, knows everybody, participates in everything. Uh, he's an artist who is identified with a whole bunch of these different isms. You know, some of the isms are stronger than others. Um, he certainly does manage to master several different of these modernist idioms, notably surrealism, cubism. He's easily the third best cubist painter after Picasso and Braque. Um, as I say, surrealism. And so I think, and he just has a fine old time of it, because I think the message of the artist we're going to look at today is work and talent. He decided to be a great artist, and he became one. And so I think with him, we're really sort of looking at the product, or sort of the harvest of these movements, when we look at these geniuses from the middle of the from the late 19th century and into the 20th century. So let me stop being cute about that and start our presentation about Joan Miro. I want to say something about his name. I mean, you know, I don't want to be too Ted Lasso about it all. Let me go back there. Colbard. You know, it's a Catalan name. Joan Miro. I would always have thought it was Juan Miro, because I sort of vaguely thought that he was, you know, Spanish. I mean, you know, and then of course, you find out about him, you learn more about him. I'm going to say Juan Miro, and I'm hoping that that's not too awful, and just be honest and say it's really not sure how to pronounce that. In English, of course, that would usually be a woman's name pronounced Joan, but Juan, I think also hitting that J with a Hua is probably a lot more likely. There you see him. Another thing about Miro that I'm not going to dwell on much, he lives for a long, long time, and he continues to be very productive. He makes a lot of massive outdoor installations and things, gets into architecture. He has a long Baroque period, if you will, later on. And I'm going to show you a couple things about that, but I mostly want to show you what an incredible accomplishment he has in those first decades of the 20th century, particularly the 1920s, when he's just there and he's just feasting on all the different ideas and styles and movements that are coming around. And he's just great at everything. So really, you know, we just look at some paintings. What I'm going to do here is show you his paintings. Again, he's a little bit younger, so I'm going to show you his paintings, and then show you the paintings, some of the paintings that influenced him, or paintings by artists who influenced him. I'm not going to show you hundreds and hundreds of paintings here. I'm only going to show you a select few paintings, just as an introduction to Miro. A few basic things there. And that first bullet point, Protean, that is an artist of many, many different periods. And as I say, we could look at those names of things. Fauvist is really not much of a category. It was kind of made up. Henri Matisse often is identified as a Fauvist. People using very bright colors and using flat planes and flattening out the perspective. And so Fauvist meaning sort of wild, really. But it was sort of a catch-all phrase for, you know, sort of post-impressionism, another sort of catch-all phrase. I think abstractionist is maybe the one that's going to get the closest to what Miro really is, or at least I think his abstractionist paintings are probably his masterpieces. It's just my opinion. So we'll get to that. As to Cubism, he was friends with the Cubists and the Surrealists. He understood what they were trying to do. Surrealism is a bigger deal Cubism a smaller movement, surrealism a broader movement, and Miro an accomplished surrealist painter. What does surrealism mean? Having realist elements and then kind of bending them to create a feeling of distance or a feeling of abstraction. Excuse me. So all right. And the second bullet point, Miro would certainly want us now, all these years later, to mention that he was a political man, and he was always paying attention to that too. He's a craftsman, he's someone he's a professional. So third bullet point, yeah, he's there, cutting a nice jib all the way through the 1920s in Paris. He's in on everything, and he makes really nice pieces, and knows everybody. So all right, so we're going to get on with it, as I say. Of course, Paul Cézanne, who is really at the center of a lot of things. But then Matisse and Picasso, these are Miro's compañeros. These are people in his community. And I think that Miro is a way to make the case for Salvador Dali, who I think right now, I mean, I get what's kitschy about Dali, but I think Dali at the moment is underrated, I think. All right, so here we have a painting by Miro, and notice the treatment of color for one thing, and of shapes, but look also at the perspective. For example, the way the still life on the table is handled. And here we have from 1889. This painting is from 1917. And that's Miro. And here is Van Gogh many years before. The treatment of the color. And then here's Matisse in 1908. Again, this is going to be 9 years later. And Miro clearly drawing a lot of lessons from Matisse. And he always understands what it is that you're doing, like when Matisse flattens the perspective out like that. Miro just has a way of sort of picking up. He's the third member of the jazz band, right? And all you have to do is play a couple, play the vamp, and he's right there with you. Now, there's a lot of these kinds of paintings by Cézanne. I just flagged them here. Cézanne, of course, always looking for fundamental shapes, break the thing down into fundamental shapes, a source of ideas for Cubism later. And here is the Cubist George Braque from 1914 with a landscape, very characteristic. Clearly you see what the idea is in terms of looking to be expressive with fundamental geometric shapes. And so that's Braque from 1914, and Cézanne we see back in the 1890s with all his quarry paintings. Really, a lot of this is coming from that. And here's Miro in 1917 with Siorana, the Path. And so always with his own distinctive style, but just mastering the genre altogether. And then he goes, Cézanne is, it's fashionable to say this these days, I admit, but Cézanne really is the one who says, look at the fundamental shapes. There are fundamental shapes that are sort of transcendental across objects. Maybe that's his idea. And then the Cubists, Picasso and Braque, are also have the same idea. And then they have this idea not only that they're getting from Cézanne, but also they're thinking about Einstein's relativity, and they're trying to break down the surface into these facets that get them outside of a uni-coordinated perspective. And Miro really works hard on this. But his work, I think, these early 1920s paintings, I think are really pretty unique. I don't think anyone's exactly, they're sort of like the synthetic cubist. They're very close contemporary to the synthetic cubist collage works of Picasso around this time, that would be what they remind me of. But I really don't think there's any other paintings quite like the ones that Miro does during this period before he really throws himself into surrealism, as we'll see in a couple slides here. Spanish cards, and you see the Cubist elements in that painting, particularly around the edges. But then he does works like this, The Farm from 1921. It's got a real Spanish feel to it. Although you can, there's Mexican stuff that looks like this. Ernest Hemingway saw this painting and was very impressed by it. Ernest Hemingway said about this painting, The Farm, that it was as expressive of Spain as James Joyce's work was expressive of Ireland. Of course, Papa somewhat hyperbolic on such matters, but he did like the painting, and it is an extraordinary painting. Maybe Magritte reminds me of Magritte a little bit. Of course, it's many. And then delving deeper into this, you find images like this, just really extraordinary work by Miro, and that is just really an incredible vista that he has put together. Now here's 3 years later after those paintings, and you see how far this looks like a Salvador Dali painting. You see that tree on the right with sort of an eye up in the top of it, and that's a kind of symbol of, the artist also looking at us, and that's a surrealist sort of symbol that's in quite a few paintings by a number of different artists, including Salvador Dali. You look for eyes in Salvador Dali looking at you. So he decides. So he goes into it. He figures it out. I think that a secret to Miro, though, I really think he doesn't take himself too seriously. He understands that he's a professional artist. He understands that he's an intellectual thinker, and that he is a practicing craftsperson, and that this is the profession that he has chosen. I mean, I just find him very sort of workmanlike. And he also, at the same time, something that's important about all of these people. Let me even stop the share for a second. If you look at modernist people, like the automatic writing of people like Gertrude Stein, or just trying to get at something that's sort of beyond language or sort of outside of language. And Miro, Miro did have a commitment to a kind of freedom. He didn't overthink it. He wanted to express elements that weren't maybe even in his own conscious. He had, again, that same sort of ethos as a writer like Stein, to try and sort of break through that. So so then you have to understand that there's a certain real humility in that kind of technical approach, and you have to take it for what it is. So all right, let's go back to the share here. We're looking at this one. And he goes on and becomes, and he has, very many paintings, and they're all very fine compositions, and they range across the spectrum from, sort of sharp surrealist things and on out into sort of, well, this kind of stuff. Now here's Paul Klee. Now notice from 1925. I'll show you some of these other painters from the 1920s, and we can look at some of the stuff where, in my view, what I would say his abstractionist paintings from the mid-1920s are Miro's most interesting paintings. But that's just to my taste, and maybe I haven't seen everything that I should. But notice the way in this Paul Klee painting from 1925 that you have those objects, the fish and the shapes. They're sort of, they're suspended in space, really. I mean, it's the perspective is actually more like that of a sort of microscopic slide, if you will. That is, you've sort of placed them into a space where they're sort of exist, and in that way maybe have their own sort of symbolic resonance. I mean, one thing about placing the objects in the space and flattening them that way, like they're on a slide, right? There's in front of them, and there's behind them. And so they then can perform more as discrete symbols. And in abstractionist painting, you know, the idea is to look at colors, look at shapes as perhaps a different kind of symbol system to communicate things that ordinary language communication couldn't do. And amazingly enough, by the way, it is Paul Cézanne who pioneers this in his paintings, as I try and unpack in the Cézanne video in this series. And here's Max Ernst, someone he quite close with Miro, and so giving you a good idea of what people are doing in the mid 1920s. Dali at the same time, 1925, and he's working out. You can see, of course, if you look at those details in the center, you see that Dali is Dali, and he's already doing his thing, but clearly working in a genre here. What a surrealist painting's supposed to look like in the middle of the 1920s. But really, I think, again, just making my case for the most interesting Miro paintings, the big influence is Kandinsky. I have a video on these Russian abstractionists. I think these paintings are incredible. And I would say that it's Kandinsky who, with that technique that we saw with Paul Klee, of sort of putting the objects into a space and therefore making the object sort of purely symbolic. I think it's really these Russian abstractionists, notably Kandinsky, who really are, you can really put your finger on that. And so synesthesia, the second bullet point on the slide, you look at these paintings and there are sort of shapes, there are fields of color, and then there are sort of shapes, they're spread out. Sometimes the effects are kind of dramatic if there's enough detail or there's enough sweep to it. But you know, the idea, I mean, the same way, say Beethoven as a romantic composer at the beginning of the 19th century, Beethoven wanted, again, to look at art as maybe a way of getting at something about, looking at music, in his case, something about the human experience that took us beyond just thinking and language. And for Beethoven and many romantics like Wagner, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, they thought that was music. So what Beethoven wanted was to sort of have a register, an index of the kinds of emotional responses that different kinds of chords and notes and progressions and other kinds of musical objects had. And these abstractionist painters, and again, the real movement is centered in the incredible Russian scene in the decades, the Leninist decades immediately after the revolution, when you know, before it got a lot darker, which had this incredible scene for about 10 or 20 years there in Moscow, St. Peter, and well, Leningrad, well, St. Petersburg, anyway. So synesthesia, what is it? It's just seeing a color as symbolic for something else. Poor Van Gogh, who really did have, you know, who was, you know, mentally ill, but he would see certain colors and shades of colors as good or evil. Some things were kind of creeping him out, and that sort of stuff. Synesthesia, again, just attaching a response that we typically have from some other modality onto a different one. And it's that idea that's at work here with these abstractionists, where they give us these highly abstract fields, okay, that the idea is that you can make it full of meaning. All right. Yeah, so I think I covered everything on that slide. So here's Vasily Kandinsky in 1920. And you see there that he's completely It's complete abstraction. So again, the revolutionary intent of the artists here is to forge some new means of expression. Perhaps new things can be expressed. It's a very optimistic uh, movement. It doesn't have the brightest colors, so it doesn't appeal to our, perhaps all of our Ted Lasso aesthetics around here. But one of the things I like most about abstraction, here's another Kandinsky from 1923, is the colors. I love the palette, that sort of subdued earth tone palette. And then, there's the whole ideology of what primary colors mean and all kinds of stuff. So here's Joan Miro, Catalan landscape from 1923. Looking very much like a surrealist a la Dali painting. And here's the Kandinsky from 1923. And here's what Miro is doing in 1923. And then here's Miro from that period. This painting, I mean, it looks, for one thing, you think of Hieronymus Bosch, of course. You notice the eye is there. Notice the reference to Salvador Dali with the towel hanging off the edge of the table on the lower right-hand side. That's from the Persistence of Memory. A big canvas and working to great expressive effect in an abstract surrealist medium. Okay, so interesting to look at. But then he moves it into another direction. So here, this could be, again, it looks like Hieronymus Bosch. Obviously, it could be something that Dali would do. But then he starts to free himself. Miro gives himself, again, remember, he believes in sort of automatic work. So, he gives himself freedom to get to the other space. And this is where he ends up. This is really, to me, so this is 1925. I really want to just, I think this is sort of the ultimate Miro painting for right now. I mean, we're not going to look at a lot more, but there's plenty more. Again, the background color, the treatment of the background color, you're pulled into looking at the lines. He's not afraid to be entertaining. But just sort of density of it. And again, a 1920s modernist painting of great ambition. And Miro, one of the things Miro does as he goes on is his pieces keep getting bigger and bigger in size. As I say, a protean artist. A lot is always coming out of him. He became quite famous later. He lives for a long time, many decades more. And he is another bridge, definitely an interesting bridge between, say, 1920s Paris and the installation art and giganticism of pop art of the 1960s. Miro's a bridge. He is, and a real bridge. Again, as with the 1920s, Miro was there. And he has a number of these, as well as monumental sculptures, which again, he did very early on, 1950s, 1940s. There he is, Joan Miro in his studio. Is that the end of that? It is. So, yeah, well, yes. So, yeah, Joan Miro, as I say, someone just a hugely talented person with a really good work ethic and a great attitude, where he's just in the center of everything. He's just soaking it all up and creating. And I think he is the walking, talking demonstration of the principle that it's really all about the work, and a delightful self-expression that he achieves. So we can work on the Impressionists of the 19th century, And then all these various different, all this kind of stuff that's going on with the modernists at the beginning of the 20th century. We do find someone who's thriving, producing all kinds of stuff, going on through all kinds of phases. After this, he gets into sculpture and all kinds of other mediums, and that is Joan Miro. So one of those happy topics where at the end, you know that there's lots more good stuff to look at and good stuff to enjoy. And that's really what it's all about. That's why I learned about the history of painting, so you can find more and more cool, good stuff to look at. All right, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.